Hello and welcome to Maybridge Community Church Online. Whether it's your first time exploring faith, or you're new to us, or you're a regular at Maybridge just tuning in for a cheeky bit of extra content, we are really glad you're here. My name is Chloe and I'm part of the staff team at Maybridge Community Church. Make sure you hit like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our online resources. If you would like to give as part of your worship, you can do so by heading to maybridge.org.uk/give. But of course, there's absolutely no pressure to do so. We are just glad you're here and we hope that you find this resource useful and helpful. For more information about faith, church family life, events, gatherings, anything that makes the Maybridge world go round, head to maybridge.org.uk or get in touch at info@maybridge.org.uk. Enjoy.
Well, hi, I'm Matt, one of the leaders here at Maybridge. Great to be with you. After a few weeks off, I'm excited that today we're back on our Radical King series. We're spending, I reckon, about 2.5 to 3 years with breaks looking at Matthew's Gospel slowly. One of the most important, incredible texts ever written. It kicks off the New Testament. It's about the life of Jesus. The thing about Matthew, and you may or may not know this, it's actually more sophisticated than it looks at first glance. If you just sat down and read it, the whole thing would probably only take a few hours. And it sort of feels like it's jumping around from stories about Jesus doing amazing things, stories about stuff Jesus has taught about God and people. And it looks like the author's just sort of pulled stuff out of the air in no particular order. But if you dig below the surface, it's actually a lot richer than that. Matthew's often called the Jewish Gospel. It's 4 Gospels. This was originally written for the benefit of Jewish people in particular. What does that even mean? Well, the way first century Jewish people thought about things was massively shaped by what we now call the Old Testament. When we say the Bible, we mean the Old Testament and the New Testament. And they just had the Old Testament. And despite what some people think, the Old Testament is not just lots of restrictions and rules. It's mostly stories and poetry, all of which shaped how people saw the world. It was the stories told around campfires, the songs sung in the rhythms of daily life, the words you needed for everything from weddings to funerals. It's a description of reality, of humanity, of theology, all wrapped into one big library of texts. And what Matthew does is take the threads of the Old Testament and says they're fulfilled in Jesus. He's like, hey, Jewish people, that big story you know, Jesus repeats it, but better. The teaching you live by, well, Jesus turns it from black and white into colour. In every way you can think of and more, he fulfills the Old Testament. He's like the laws, but better. He's like the nation of Israel, but better. He's like their greatest teacher, Moses, but better. He's like their greatest king, David, but better. So Matthew shows us Jesus acting out ideas and stories and predictions and themes from the Old Testament, but doing the greater version of them. A few weeks ago, we looked at the first bit of Matthew 12, where Jesus takes a big Old Testament idea, the Sabbath, and shows how the religious leaders of his time have completely missed the point of it. But he also, in the midst of the conversation, says this line, I am the master of the Sabbath. In other words, he's saying, take that incredible Old Testament idea, 1 day in 7 of rest, originates with God. He says, and I'm above the whole thing. And the religious leaders don't like this because it means he's saying he's equal to God. To them, it's blasphemy. And so Matthew 12, verse 14, where we left off, says simply this, but the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. This is a chilling line for many reasons. These people are the spiritual leaders of Israel. They've seen what Jesus has done. They know what he's about. And not only do they not like him, the plan is to kill him. Everything Jesus has done up to this moment is inarguably good. He's healed people. He's taught how to live with compassion and integrity. He's been radically inclusive to marginalised people. If a politician did this sort of thing, they'd be wildly popular. Even their biggest opponents would at least respect them. But the thing Jesus has done is said that he's equal to God, and that causes a problem. It forces a reaction. If a person in any time or place claims to be God, it forces a reaction. But for a moment, think about how Jesus felt when this happened. He knew who he was. He knew what people were like. But think about how it must have felt to come to the world with a mission of love, to self-sacrifice, and even though he knew what was coming, this was the moment when humanity revealed its hand. The very people who should have worshipped him first planned to kill him. This is the first moment when that happens. Think how devastating, how saddening that would be. And along with the sadness, how angry you would feel, how much you or I might want to prove ourselves in this situation, maybe to get our attack in first. Jesus had the crowds in the palm of his hand. He could probably have turned them against these religious leaders and staged a takeover. And even if not, he's already shown at this point that he has a power far beyond any normal person. He could start a fight that he would definitely win. But he doesn't. I think understanding that backdrop really helps us to see what happens in today's passage. And although it's one of those passages that you might normally skim over to what seems to be a more exciting bit, it actually tells us something really important about what Jesus is like. And it's great. So let's have a look at the whole thing. Matthew 12:15-21. Aware of this, that's the plan to kill him, Jesus withdrew from that place. A large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill. He warned them not to tell others about him. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has brought justice through to victory. In his name, the nations will put their hope. So this is a little summary of how Jesus responds to death threats for the first time. Remember that first bit said, aware of this, Jesus withdrew from that place. A large crowd followed. He healed all who were ill. He warned them not to tell us about him. Jesus was aware of the plan to kill him. We don't know how he was aware, but he was aware. Look at how he responds. Doesn't look for a fight. Doesn't become difficult. He withdraws. He stands down. He goes somewhere else. But not only that, rather than lash out or even just go focus on himself for a bit, he keeps on serving. A big crowd follows, and he heals the sick. And then he warns them not to tell anybody. That's the first thing that stands out. Whatever Jesus is about, whatever Jesus is doing, he's not just about attention. A person who can supernaturally heal people draws attention. That's not normal. Jesus at this moment could just ramp up the fame. But he's not whipping up crowds. He's not building an aggressive movement. He's not reaching for Instagram followers. He heals people out of love, but he wants to keep who he is under wraps until the right time. It's about the plan, not the publicity. And then Matthew says this is to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Now, we're into one of those bits of the Gospels that people usually jump over. We might think, well, I want some miracles and some amazing teacher, blah, 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 Isaiah, something or other. I don't need to bother with that. Let's get to the exciting stuff. I totally understand if that's you, because I've done that too. But Matthew's telling us the way Jesus responds, the moment he's threatened with execution, tells us something about him that is so important that it fulfills something that was deliberately placed in the Old Testament 800 years earlier, ready to prepare and encourage an entire nation for him. And he's saying anyone who comes along after should know about this. And the quotes from Isaiah chapter 42. All the way through Isaiah, there's this theme that for all the bad things that happen to Israel or to the world, there's help on the way. It's full of what are called messianic prophecies. In other words, little descriptions of this person, or this Messiah, who would one day come along and be the answer. Here are some examples. Isaiah 7 says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. Isaiah 9 says, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. And then Isaiah 53, quite a famous passage, it says, surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray, each of us has turned our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And that, many would say, that points forward to what happened with Jesus on the cross. And through all these predictions, Isaiah is saying, this is God's antidote to the problems of the world, this person, this Messiah or Saviour. But in today's passage, Matthew quotes from chapter 42 of Isaiah, and it's deliberate because Matthew's saying, when Jesus does what he does here, when he gets the death threats, that he's living out Isaiah 42. So let's look in more detail. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I'll put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. Isaiah writes as if from God's point of view, and the first line talks about the relationship God will have with the Messiah. This is somebody God has chosen. but not chosen like, there's a lineup of people and God says, right, I'll have that one. It's more like if I said about my wife, having already married her, I choose her. The relationship's already there. It's after that is already true that God the Father says of Jesus, I'm sending him, I'm sending this person I love greatly into humanity. I delight in him, my spirit will be on him, I'll send him into the world. Why? To proclaim justice to the nations. But don't miss what that means. It's not justice like going around telling everybody to be more just, or the modern idea of social justice particularly, or even the courts of law. If you follow what Jesus says and does, it's all about the Hebrew idea of justice, tzedek, which is actually a relational term. It's about people living in right relationship with God, one another, and the creation around them. And so what God says through Isaiah is staggering. He says to the people of Israel, this guy is going to come along, this Messiah, and pronounce justice on an epic scale to the whole world. But it's not an aggressive thing. The next line says, he will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. It's a poetic way of saying the Messiah isn't going to go looking for arguments. He won't pick fights. Loads of people thought the Messiah would be a great military leader who's going to go and beat up the Romans. But no, Jesus is not going to battle with the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the Romans or anyone else. The only times you see Jesus get riled and angry and push back against people are when he's concerned about the effect on others. He criticises the Pharisees, for example, for leading people astray. He criticised those who make money by exploiting people who are at the temple to worship. But he doesn't go looking for fights. He comes to serve, not to impose himself. Then it says, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has brought justice through to victory. In his name the nations will put their hope. And this takes the poetry further. A bruised reed would have been very fragile, and so this is saying this Messiah would be gentle, unexpectedly gentle. He won't even snuff out a smouldering wick, a candle that's almost about to go out. Such is the delicate and sensitive way he'll go about his mission, all the way until he has ensured justice and put relationships right. And despite this non-aggressive, gentle way, which is the opposite to what everybody thought the Messiah should do, the nations will put their hope in him. People will say, I'm looking to this guy for what I need, for my future. And so that's what Isaiah says this Messiah will do. Matthew picks up on that and says, this Jesus is the fulfillment of that. It's him. And it's not just that Jesus is God and he's the Jewish Messiah and he fulfills the Old Testament stuff. He certainly does those things. But also, this is what he's like. This is how he behaves. And so this passage tells us what God is like, and it's incredible. What happens to Jesus and how he responds in this passage is the template for what it's like between each one of us and God. In our natural selves, we all want Jesus out of the picture. You could say we want him to die. We want to be in charge. We want to justify ourselves, to have our way, to impose our view of how things should be in life and squeeze out anyone who interferes. We've all got that in us. But God isn't after an argument or a fight. Despite what we're like, he sends his own son to proclaim and create justice in our relationships, to reconcile us. And even though Jesus is not the Messiah in the way any of us would have dreamed up, there's a thing that happens when people realise what he's like. And this posture of gentleness towards us, somehow, paradoxically, people of all nations and tribes and worldviews respond to him, just like Isaiah said would happen. Here's what's happening in a nutshell. Jesus comes to serve and to heal. The religious leaders respond by wanting to kill him off. He responds in turn by withdrawing from a fight that he could easily win, because his way is not about self-assertion, but about self-giving. Think about that. God is God. He's the most powerful thing you could imagine 1,000,000 times over. He could crush you in an instant. And despite what you're like, and I'm like, he patiently and graciously not only puts up with our shenanigans, but continually and repeatedly and gently seeks tzedek, justice, with you and I. So what do we do with this? Well, a couple of thoughts. One, how we relate to God, and one, how we relate to other people, as modelled by Jesus in this passage. Firstly, relating to God. Obviously, there are loads of things people believe about God. But the two most influential views, broadly speaking, over thousands of years, are Christianity and Islam, on a global scale. And those two views of the world say remarkably different things about God. This is not a playground contest of my God is better than your God or anything like that, but the inner character of the God of Islam and the God of Christianity are profoundly different. And I'm making this contrast not because I'm interested in critiquing Islam, but to demonstrate how much this really matters, how we see God matters. In Islam, Allah, their word for God, is powerful and righteous and to be worshipped. And on a really basic level, you could say that's not much different to the Christian view of God. But dig a little deeper. Allah cannot be defined. He cannot be insulted. In Islam, Jesus is respected, but the idea that he was crucified offends Muslims. Now, why is that? Well, one Muslim I read a quote from said, Muslims believe that Allah saved the Messiah from the ignominy of crucifixion. Another said, we honour Jesus more than you Christians do. We refuse to believe that God would permit him to suffer death on the cross. Do you see the underlying belief? The underlying belief is that God could not, lower himself to accepting mockery, to be treated in such a way. And the practical implication of this is that in Islamic society, Allah has to be represented by force. He has to be elevated by repressing human behaviour, through strength and hierarchy and restriction, through imposing of the will. The job of Allah's leaders on earth is to police how he is worshipped. A few years ago, you may remember a French newspaper published some pictures of Muhammad that were deemed to be offensive. And in response, the offices of this newspaper were attacked and a number of people were sadly killed. Now, of course, not all Muslims would personally approve of this sort of violence, but it's a strong example of what is the Islamic view, that Allah, and therefore his prophet Muhammad, must be honoured. And if he isn't, then blood will be shed. And the passage we've looked at today makes no sense to Islam, to that view of God. With Christianity, and by that I don't mean Christians, I mean with Jesus in particular, it's different. God is different. In Christianity, God's response to disrespect is not fear or weakness or shows of strength. It's love. Jesus is mocked, spat at, insulted, flogged, rejected, ignored, and crucified. At no single point does he respond with violence or aggression or imposition or harsh words or even sarcasm. When we are at our absolute worst, he continues in love. In Christianity, the heart of God is for self-sacrifice, for taking on the insult and the rage and the disrespect, and making a genius move nobody else would have thought of, putting it all on himself on a cross. At the moment of ultimate disregard and hate, God does not reply back with the same thing. He takes it on and then declares, I've won. On the cross, in a sense, Jesus wins by losing. Humanity did its worst. We killed the Son of God. Everything we could throw at him was done. But he's big and tough enough to take it and then rise again. And the whole thing was out of love for the very people doing the evil towards him. And it was part of the plan. That's what the Christian God is like. If you've seen Jesus, you've seen God, you've seen what he's like. He doesn't want to quarrel with you or shout at you. He's so gentle, he wouldn't break a reed or snuff out a candle. What a relief that that is how God is. That's what he's like. How approachable, how safe, how profoundly is he exactly what we want and need. And then secondly, relating to others. How you see God spills over into how you are with other people. In fact, I think what you really at core believe about God is the biggest influence on how you do everything in life. In my experience, when people grasp what God is really like, not what they think he's like, and for many of us we grow up thinking God is like what's been patterned by our parents, that's a whole other story. But when people grasp what he's really like, not just in the head but in the heart, there comes a gentleness, a graciousness, a flexibility. Last week we spoke about some of the spiritual disciplines, things that are good habits for followers of Jesus to do. And one of them was submission, the practice of not getting your own way, even when maybe you could. And our world is full of people battling to get their way, imposing yourself, fighting for your success, putting number one first. And these things are now even seen as great virtues in our culture. When people beat everyone else to get their way, it's celebrated as great leadership or admired as having great strength. But the way of Jesus is different. Richard Foster's book, which I mentioned before, A Celebration of Discipline, says some great stuff about what submission means. He writes, in submission, we are at last free to value other people. Their dreams and plans become important to us. We've entered into a new glorious freedom, the freedom to give up our own rights for the good of others. No longer do we feel that we have to be treated in a certain way. It is of little consequence that our plans are frustrated if their plans succeed. We discover that it's far better to serve our neighbour than have our own way. Now, of course, it needs to be said, the discipline of submission is not meant to be an excuse for controlling people. It's the opposite. Submission is when you have a choice and you use that choice to say, I'm not going to have my way. If it's forced, it's not submission. You can only submit if you already have power and you choose to let go of it like Jesus does. Now, we're unlikely to have people plotting to kill us, and it's not our job to save humanity through death and resurrection, but in our own small way, submission is where we can mirror Jesus, not imposing ourselves, not having to have our preferences, not manipulating conversations our way. And so I want to give you a practical challenge for this week. When a situation comes up where you could easily get your own way, choose not to get it. Make it your own choice. I mean, don't comply with something bad. Don't agree to an armed robbery out of submission or anything like that. But try not getting your choice for dinner or the film that you were going to watch with somebody, or don't get the best seat on the bus, or whatever it may be. There'll be something, and then afterwards, reflect on it. Think about what happened, about why it was a good thing to do, what it did to you. How did it make you feel? How did it give you a taste of what Jesus did by submitting, in his case, on the greatest scale imaginable? Let's pray. Father, thank you that you chose and sent your Son to deal with the problem of our sin. And it runs deeper than any of us likes to believe. Thank you that Jesus models the right way to be, of submission, of deferring to the other, of choosing to not take the self-promoting, aggressive, assertive path. Pray that you would help us to be patterned after him more and more.